Pakistan might be doing all sorts of crazy stuff all around the world, including within Pakistan. And that doesn't really make news. I mean, you are drastically more likely to come across a story about Indian quote unquote genocide.
We are the slumdog millionaire people. We are exotic. We are uncivilized. We are poor. We are corrupt. We are, everything is dirty.
Ilhan Omar, this Muslim woman from Somalia, went to a hearing on Kashmir for a subcommittee she wasn't even part of, and essentially gave testimony that was almost virtually identical for all practical purposes of the stuff that some of the Stand with Kashmir and some of these other Islamist groups are putting out.
China was able to shape the narrative about lab leak and the origins of COVID in the very, very early days of the pandemic. It didn't take much. It just took a lot of money and a lot of access, and a lot of the access came through American institutions.
Pre-2014, any newspaper, even in India for that matter, trying to take a slightly right of center position was not taken seriously. But now it is okay.
Far left pushes all kinds of things that one would never rationally think an Islamist would be in favor of. Gay rights, trans rights, a bunch of abortion, things that just don't fit right at all.
A very good evening, namaste, and welcome to Citti Media. I'm your host, Citti. Today we are bringing together a very special panel discussion on the Western media's bias or alleged bias against India. Now, if you're someone who recognizes India when you've watched Slumdog Millionaire, then perhaps you must watch the entire debate, because what we are going to be discussing with an eminent set of panelists today is this almost condescending attitude towards India that is exhibited by certain institutions, not just limited to the West, but also to our neighbors in Pakistan and China. And this is going to be examined holistically by Joyeeta Basu, editor of the Sunday Guardian, Ashley Rindsberg, a very well-known author. He was here last time on our platform, and Cliff Smith, the director of Washington's Middle East Forum, joins us today. Namaste. Thank you so much for being here. This is a very promising panel. Let me begin by asking Mr. Rindsberg. And first of all, we have sort of a policy here at Citti. And you know how the Japanese have sans and perhaps the French call monsieur. We'll address you by G. So I'll call you Ashley G. And the suffix is out of respect. So Ashley G, first of all, is there an institutionalized racism against countries like India, the third world attitude that is meted out? Is this limited to the New York Times? Because obviously you have a best-selling book that talks about such attitude institutionalized in Western media agencies like the New York Times, but does it stop there?
I think there's a clear agenda at work with regard to India, and not just India, but other countries that don't fall along the right axis for certain media organizations, and they want to be able to continue to put out this idea of a certain kind of worldview where only certain practices in a country are acceptable, and anything that deviates from this model for acceptable nations is just condemned roundly by the media as in illegitimate and invalid. And I think that's a lot what we're seeing with India. And I think when you have a Western newspaper coming in and pushing its agenda and pushing its narrative at the expense of this country, that definitely is a form of colonialism. They're basically, it's not that they're judging by their own values what's happening in the country, which is okay. I mean, that's something that I think we would all sort of do in various ways. But it's the fact that they are imposing a standard that is completely alien to not just the values that are at work in countries like India, but also the reality on the ground. I mean, that's the biggest problem, is that what's getting reported in the Western media, and particularly United States media, it just does not accord with the very, very complex realities in India, in Israel, in other places. And that to me is the real problem, is that these countries and the objective reality that take place in them is being forced into this ideological narrative that's all driven by an agenda. And to me, that's why it's so problematic and so alarming.
This is extremely agenda driven, and that's why it is problematic, is what Ashley ji says. Joyeeta ji, first of all, welcome for the first time on our channel. It's a pleasure to have you here. And do you think this holds true only when a certain quote unquote right-wing fascist government is in place? Or is this like a general attitude that the press carries, and now even some policymakers carry against India, that goes beyond Modi or the Bharatiya Janata Party for that matter?
Thank you, Sharon, for inviting me to this show. And in fact, that's what exactly I was thinking before this show. Now, when you look at the Western media's coverage, there is a difference between the coverage in terms of pre-Modi and now that Modi is here. There is a difference in the sense we were, of course, the slumdog millionaires. As you mentioned, we are the slumdog millionaire people. We are exotic, we are uncivilized, we are poor, we are corrupt, we are, everything is dirty. If you remember the kind of coverage the British media in particular was doing around the time of the Commonwealth Games. And it was horrible coverage, but we were harmless. Okay, now the change that has taken place is that now we are being portrayed as being harmful. Now, when we are talking about harmful, now what is harmful? We are apparently, standing right on the precipice of having a genocide. Just imagine that a country like India, where we are talking about, say, 1.3 billion people, out of which maybe the Muslim community is around 14%, 15%, or 20%. Think in terms of numerically what that number is. Is it possible for any country to commit a genocide? But that is the narrative that is being spun. So what has happened is that with the coming of Mr. Modi, because you see, the Western press has always had a problem with Mr. Modi. One of the reasons why is, of course, that Gujarat, we all know what happened in Gujarat, but the fact that he got a clean chit from right up to the Supreme Court, that they could not pin anything on him. And there were a lot of nonsense was said, but the fact is that they have a problem with that. A lot of that has come from inside our own country, we know that. But at the same time, they were bearing with us when it comes to the Western media. They were bearing with us because we were being ruled by people like them. Left liberal, Western educated. But what has happened in India in 2014, there has been more democratization of power, if I can say it that way. Power has actually gone to the people beyond a certain family, beyond a set of family, beyond this Oxford educated, beyond the Harvard educated. These are people who have come from the grassroots. So this is a huge change. So what has happened is that, and along with that, what is hurting their sensibilities is that these people are openly, they're not apologetic about their religious identity. Now, the minute that is happening, now they are getting bracketed as Hindu nationalist. If you look at the coverage that the Western media does of, say, something like Imran Khan, even though he can get away, but he actually gets away by saying things like, women should be covered. Because if a woman is not covered from head to toe, there are going to be consequences in society. This is the kind of Neanderthal-like statements that Imran Khan can give, and he gets away by it. Now, even if our leaders, our prime minister keeps quiet and says nothing about it, something or the other is going to be picked up, and that becomes a huge issue. if Sharan, what has happened with this Haridwar incident, there was this fringe group hothead saying all sorts of nonsense and action got taken. But that was picked up. I think if you go and ask people, if anyone cares about what these people were saying, these fringe groups about, there should not be minorities, some nonsense they said. The thing is that no one cared. I mean, outside that particular auditorium that they talked about, no one is bothered. Okay, but the thing is that became a big issue in the West. So what is happening is that cherry picking is happening. They already had a bias. Now what they're trying to do is that a lot of, I would say, fake information, sometimes twisted information is going into it to serve their confirmation bias. And who are the people feeding it? We'll get into that later.
Thank you so much. Excellent points. If I were to summarize what you just tried to say, after Mr. Modi came to power, the English-speaking Lutyens elites who used to write columns for Washington Post and New York Times suddenly are somehow irrelevant because there is a growing intelligentsia that communicates to the larger masses in local languages. Maybe it's Hindi, maybe it's Kannada, it's Malayalam. So all of these are reduced to perhaps a $5,000 sanctioned column for the Washington Post, and we know who we are talking about. These are excellent points. And also when it comes to Pakistan and West Asian countries, speaking about Kashmir or human rights in India and about how India has sort of been committing a genocide against 250 million Muslims, while they're very silent about what happens with Uyghurs, is something that needs to be asked, Cliff G.
Let me put it this way. She said something interesting that I think is true. I also think it misses something, and that is she talked about how the coverage changed after Modi became prime minister. I think there's some truth to that for sure. I would argue, admittedly, I come from the West, so I see it from perhaps a different perspective, but I would say the real change came right around the time of Modi's reelection and the constitutional changes with regard to Kashmir. And I think that was not an accident. I mean, yes, there are some of these other elements she speaks of. I'm not denying that. However, there was a very conscious push around that same time, especially after the abrogation of 370, by Islamist actors in the United States, with their roots in Pakistan, oftentimes, but not always. And this gets into a whole other issue in terms of sort of the allies some of these groups have made by non-South Asian Islamists, by Muslim Brotherhood types, by others that from other parts of the world. And you can see this very clearly. I actually wrote a column about this a couple of years ago. A guy who I believe is actually ethnically Indian, but an Indian Muslim named Asad Isa, writes for some Qatari outlets, and he wrote an article a couple of days after the Pulwama attack, basically blaming India for the attack and saying that, and making a comparison of basically Kashmiri jihadists and Palestinians, and basically saying, Palestinians are good and their cause is just, and the Kashmiris are good and their cause is also just. So basically, we have, these 70 dead cops, and that's the fault of the colonizer, occupier, and that was put out in a Qatari media outlet. And these are the same kinds of folks that are giving cues, whether they intend to or not, and I think oftentimes they do, to groups like the Islamic Circle of North America, one of the largest chapters of Jamaat-e-Islami in the world, that is giving, that are basically giving the same line as groups like CARE, like 100 other Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist movement linked groups. There was a very conscious effort to push these kinds of narratives by them. I mean, it's very, very clear. They weren't shy about it. They put it on their websites, they put it in articles, and they lobbied their members of Congress. There was a very interesting moment, I thought. There's a group called Stand with Kashmir that is very shadowy. They appear to be linked to Jamaat-e-Islami activists and anti-Israeli activists, but they not a 501c3. They don't report their money in the same way. Nobody really knows where they get their money. And they were writing stuff right after the abrogation of 370, basically just attacking India, calling any security measures a genocide, so on and so forth. And a week or two later, or maybe it was a few days, I can't remember the exact timeline. Ilhan Omar, this Muslim woman from Somalia, went to a hearing on Kashmir for a subcommittee she wasn't even part of, and essentially gave testimony that was almost virtually identical for all practical purposes of the stuff that some of the Stand with Kashmir and some of these other Islamist groups are putting out. Is that a coincidence? Maybe, but I kind of doubt it. I mean, I'm not saying they wrote her talking points, but she was certainly getting her information from the same kind of sources. And so, there's a lot of factors. I'm not saying it's just that or just the other. My point would be, though, that I don't think you should discount the fact that media are getting their information from these kinds of actors. They're taking some of their cues from politicians that are taking different stances. And you can't then be shocked when people that don't really know much about India or Pakistan are told something that they buy it without too much question. I mean, I think you have a problem in the media in general that isn't specific to India, of just reporters reporting on things that they don't have a great expertise in. But this makes it much worse.
You bring up a lot of interesting points, and in fact, this is something to introspect on. Because you see, there is a silence when we don't have a problem if you want to speak about human rights in India, and even we care about human rights, in case if you've not noticed. But the strategic silence on what happens to Muslims themselves in Pakistan, for that matter, communities like Shias and Ahmadiyas, Prime Minister Imran Khan is absolutely silent, and the most authoritative regimes get a representation on the Human Rights Council, and these are the questions which are not asked. Is why a lot of people are angry about.
Yeah. I definitely think there's kind of a double standard there. I think that there is a tendency that is on one level kind of understandable, but on another level deeply toxic. And that is, I do think there are people that sort of tell themselves, and this applies to Israel, this applies to some other states, where it's kind of like, sure, the other, their opponents are far worse, these other regimes are far worse, but Israel and India being democratic, they can actually be moved. I mean, the democracy in Pakistan is, shall we say, highly theoretical. And so I do think the honest ones will kind of admit to themselves, well, sure, things are much worse in Pakistan, but, if I see something wrong in India, I can maybe move the needle a little bit, make it a little bit better. That's the honest ones will tell themselves. The dishonest ones are either clueless and or bigoted. And I do think all three of those fit into how that ends up happening. I think it's not always clear which one is happening, but I do think at different times all those factors can play in.
Thank you so much for that. Ashley, do you think there is an overrepresentation from one section in the media and institutions that essentially form perception about a particular community and a country? Because it seems that a lot of people are complaining about the woke culture seeping into Indian universities as well. And this is very reflective of what is happening in countries like America.
Yeah, I think, I think we're kind of seeing from exactly what Cliff and Joyeeta said, is that it's not the media on its own that's perpetrating this narrative. It is all very tied together with academia, with political elites, with the global order. So I absolutely think that certain media outlets, they almost have something like a pipeline of influence to certain other places, and the pipeline, there's clearly a pipeline between the legacy media at least in the United States and elite universities probably around the world. And part of that pipeline is also what's now becoming globalized culture. So who is Neil Young backing, and how does it all align, in his case with the Democratic Party, with the New York Times? They're all really neatly aligned. And this is something that concerns me as a media observer, which is that we used to have this tension between government and media, that the media would protect itself from the government through press freedoms. Today, you often have this scenario where the media is working hand in glove with certain parts of the government and certain governments. So in this case, it's very clear that the media is not opposed. There's not a tension between the media and the Biden administration. They're very nicely aligned. And, I think the flip side of that we're seeing is that other governments and other regimes find a very sympathetic ear with the media. So just as Cliff was saying, Pakistan might be doing all sorts of crazy stuff all around the world, including within Pakistan. And that doesn't really make news. I mean, you are drastically more likely to come across a story about Indian quote unquote genocide, about the latest one I saw just recently, something about the narrative about India in the New York Times, the narrative of India as repressive and backward. It is so homogenous in the way they report on those specific countries. It never deviates, never. And that's what truly shocks me, is that you can look and say, all right, maybe they've had this kind of coverage, and they want to sort of sprinkle out some counterbalance with some positive coverage or neutral coverage, but it's never like that. It is always just one thing. And that's, right. I think that is what it not only affects academia and culture, but is also affected by academia and culture. It's a dynamic interaction.
Wonderfully said. And in fact, I think with what is happening with the Democrats and Mr. Biden, I think the microphone has kind of picked it up. So that echoes the sentiment of how he treats a certain section of the media. But, if we were to flip this question, Joyeeta ji, and say that perhaps there is a underrepresentation, at least in the English parts of the media, for the so-called Hindu nationalist side, or that is sympathetic towards it. Would you agree with me? Because I know that your organization and you were under duress and you've been attacked several times in the past just because you speak your mind. And this is something that's institutionalized because we are constantly under attack by one section of the press, and they're the ones who get to play the victim card. Not that I'm complaining about it.
Yes, Sharon, I think this, when we are talking about, nationalism, our sense of nationalism is very different from the way the West sees it. You know that. After all, nationalism, there is something to do with colonialism, and a whole lot of other things are associated with it. But in India, we don't think of it like that. We don't see nationalism as oppressive, as majoritarianism. No, it is not like that. It is just, we think that India is a great country. It is simple as that. That is at the simplest level. That is how it operates in India. So, but at the same time, when you look, you have to, all of us know the narrative all these days has been controlled by a particular set of people. So it is these people, and they are the ones who have always found their voices, even in the West. If you look at academia, for that matter, it is much everywhere, particularly in the West. All the Indians who are going there and starting to teach there or are teaching there are very, very radically left, in fact. If you look at the kind of stuff that they write, and also they will, and there is this whole concept of intersectionality that comes into this place, where, if we are going to talk about gender rights, you have to talk about Dalit rights also. And, you have to also talk about Black rights. So all these things that have come into play, as a result of which, in academic space, in media space, the voice that is, I'm not going to say Hindu nationalist, I'm going to say right of center, or for that matter, even center, centrist, that has been excluded to a large extent. It has happened in the West. It has happened in India. And the thing is that it's only now, I would say in the last 7-8 years, it is becoming acceptable. If I remember, in fact, earlier, pre-2014, any newspaper, even in India for that matter, trying to take a slightly right of center position was not taken seriously. But now it is okay. Now it is okay, because you see, and now you see, even in our political discourse, if you look at it, Sharon, at one point of time, it was looked down upon. I would say even pre-2014, and institutionally, it was looked down upon to proclaim that you belong to maybe the Hindu religion, Okay, because and we were constantly told you are secular, you are secular, you are secular. So your Hindu identity has to take a backseat. So that that has gone, that does not matter anymore. While in terms of electing someone, people were being conscious. There's no doubt about it, and especially in certain polarized constituencies. Uttar Pradesh elections are going on, and we know that there is bound to be some polarization at the political level also. But it's only now that we see even leaders of the Congress running to temples and all, because they never thought that it was important to woo the Hindus. They were taken for granted. It is now that is happening. The mainstreaming has started now. So as a result of which you see lots of channels and news agencies and these YouTube channels and our paper and all that now they have started talking about that there is a different kind of India also, and that is not a bad one. I don't think, what has happened even in the Western media, it is extremely polarized. Now, when it is polarized, so it is either the Trump media or it is the New York Times media. There's no meeting ground. So let us, and that is where I think the huge divide is coming in. It is there in India, but I think it is more pronounced in the West.
Thank you so much for these points. It somehow seems that an alliance that would be probably unfavorable or not possible a few years ago is happening now at a global scale. And what I mean is that you see a lot of Islamist organizations and Islamist agendas being fueled through the hard left in the press. And both of these guys just didn't get along. If if you were to see even our recent history, and this is happening in India, this is happening abroad as well. Cliff, how does this work in terms of how all these agendas are institutionalized? Is there a larger pattern at play here?
There is definitely a larger pattern here, and it is frankly very difficult to tease out how it works and sort of how the overlays go. The funny thing I would mention to this is, and some of my colleagues at the Middle East Forum, Sam Westrop and Martha Lee especially, have done some interesting work on this, and they could probably tell you better than I could, but it goes both ways in an interesting way, because I mean, the far left pushes all kinds of things that, one would never rationally think an Islamist would be in favor of, gay rights, trans rights, a bunch of, abortion, things that just don't fit, right, at all. And at the same time, Islamists are pushing things, that, essentially quasi-theocracy, all kinds of, conservative dress requirements and family requirements that that you would think the left would never accept. An interesting question to ask, it's certainly in the West, you see, is sort of while there's very clear that particularly on issues of Islamophobia, as they would call it, or racism, they see them as the same thing, and they try to sort of homogenize it all as the same thing, and that any legitimate concerns about a political ideology, such as Islamism, are conflated with being anti-Muslim or racist. They're definitely doing that. But there's an interesting, weird thing here that's happening when you actually see, some imams and, some hardline imams getting concerned that they have all these young Muslims that all of a sudden are, actually wearing rainbow flags and all this kind of thing. So the point is, it's a very unstable alliance. It's a very real alliance. And frankly, I think it is impossible to look at, just the social media feeds of any number of Islamist group or even leftist groups that deal with these kinds of causes and not realize that there is an obvious alliance. It's very out in the open. They don't bother to try to hide it. They don't even pretend that it's not there. At the same time, what you're speaking of, it is unlikely because it is unstable. It isn't something that naturally occurring. Somebody eventually is going to wind up on the top of this dog pile, and I don't really know how that's going to play out.
One of the enablers of this alliance, would you say, is the lobbying power? Whether it's China or Pakistan, it's an open secret that many of these diplomats have a very good lobbying power in Washington. And that perhaps is a reason why a certain attitude is also reflected towards certain countries.
I mean, I certainly think that's a part of it. I think media actually, and is in some ways a bigger. People make a lot of some wealthy lobbyist in DC that is funding somebody's campaign and speaking to someone on the other side and, is getting things done. And that can certainly happen in small things that aren't getting lots of public attention. I think that has a lot less to do with things that are getting a lot of public attention. And I think that to the degree these things get public attention, I do think that media, grassroots activism probably has more to do with it. That said, it is worth noting that in the case of Pakistan in particular, a man by the name of Ghulam Nabi Fai is one of the only people that I know of to ever actually get convicted of violating the Foreign Agent Registration Act. I mean, he was taking tens of millions from Pakistan, funneling into essentially pro-Pakistan positions versus, I'm forgetting the name of the group. It was he's had several groups with similar names. I think it was the Kashmiri Council or something like that. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact name. But the point was, he funneled tens of millions of dollars into activism on Pakistan's side on Kashmir. And then ended up actually getting convicted because he wasn't reporting that, he wasn't going through the proper channels, went to jail, got out, and is now doing the exact same thing. Now, I cannot prove that he is still getting Pakistani money for doing that. But the point is, Pakistan is one of the few states that has actually gotten caught giving tens of millions of dollars covertly to try to, warp American opinion in their direction. Is that still going on? It wouldn't shock me. I can't prove it. I'm not saying it is, but if it were happening, I wouldn't be totally shocked. And the reason I wouldn't be totally shocked was they've been caught before. And you certainly have sympathetic audiences, not only in the Pakistani diaspora, which might be understandable, even if misguided in my view, but also in different Islamist groups. And as you point out, since these Islamist groups are close with other leftist groups, it winds up being a channel to fairly powerful people in Congress and in the administration at times.
This is perhaps more covert when it comes to American politics, and it's a little more visible when it comes to British politics, especially with the conviction of people like Lord Nazir, who was being paid by the ISI, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of lawmakers, especially linked to the Labour Party, have taken funding openly from countries like China and Pakistan. And if you look at their track record in the parliament, they've openly spoken against India, against what's happening in Kashmir and things like that. So the pattern is quite visible out there. Now, the other country perhaps which we've been having sort of a rough phase with is China. And China, although it tries to be the best propaganda maker out there, is miserably failing at it. Condolences to those guys. But Ashley, you've been studying China as well, and there are scarily similar patterns as to how the New York Times covered Nazi Germany and how China is perhaps looking at human rights violations in places like Xinjiang and Tibet, for that matter.
Yeah, it's it's a power quotient. I think China is very adept at using hard and soft power in order to propagate its messaging. And it's no holds barred. It will spare no expense. This, you would think, as this very hard power regime, they may not be as predisposed to make these enormous expenditures on soft power, but they really do, and it really works. I mean, I'm sort of looking at how China was able to shape the narrative about lab leak and the origins of COVID in the very, very early days of the pandemic. It didn't take much. Like it just took a lot of money and a lot of access, and a lot of the access came through American institutions. So the Chinese used these institutions, again, like a pipeline. So they identify the pipeline, they know where the information is and the influence and the access is flowing, and they tap it. It's not that complex conceptually. Why other countries are not as adept, I think that's something that has to do with the structure of government in China. Like they're able to just go after these types of campaigns and prosecute them to the utmost, whereas the US or India or Israel, there's so much infighting and disagreement because of the nature of democracy that you're not able to put all your weight behind a single message and then do whatever it takes to get the message out there. And China is very, very good at doing that. And also, we can see from, this sort of is again, it's a product of China's authoritarian government structure, because the New York Times has been banging on China's door, trying to get into that marketplace for, I would say, at least 10 years. And that's a huge, amazing market to access. 1.4 billion people, they want in, but they know that to get in, the New York Times has to play ball with China. They cannot report certain things in certain ways. Otherwise, they will absolutely never get into that market. India, on the other hand, does not have that restriction. You're already in the Indian market as an American news organization because it's an open country. There's freedom of the press, freedom to report. So India doesn't have that kind of leverage that China does, even though the market sizes are relatively the same. By restricting it, China has given itself this huge lever. And by playing ball, the New York Times has enabled that to happen, essentially.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This conversation was absolutely delightful and enlightening, and I'm sure our audience are going to agree with me. Now, dear audience, we've never asked you for money or donations or paid subscriptions of any kind. And the only way that we know that you're listening to us and that you're supporting us is by clicking on that subscribe button. And that is all I request you to do. And this is not a request that you hear from me very often. So please do subscribe to us, click on the button, and please do stay tuned to Citti Media. And we are going to bring you more conversations like this, especially on decoloniality, about media bias, about politics, foreign affairs, national security, and you name it, dharma, culture, etc. Till then, stay tuned. I'm your host, Sharan Citti, signing off.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.